Think about this morning's scripture reading in Matthew chapter 23. Before we get into today's lesson, Matthew chapter 23 is such an easy chapter to do a lesson on because we point the finger. We look at the scribes, we look at the Pharisees, and we say, oh, those evil people. And it's so easy to talk about that. But today, instead of talking about the scribes and the Pharisees, and instead of doing a lesson on our Bible reading, today I want to do a lesson that has been requested. And I have to say this lesson was very difficult to prepare. It's really out of my normal style. But this lesson reflects rather on someone else's wrongs, it reflects on ourselves and what I'm doing wrong. And that's why it was difficult for me to prepare. Dawn had asked for a lesson regarding anger and controlling anger. And probably over a year ago, or around a year ago, I had done a lesson entitled Anger Management. And so I thought, well, I've done anger management. I've got to go a different direction. I've got to try to not only fulfill what Dawn might need, but I need to fulfill what I might need. And preaching the same is certainly not going to do me any good. And so I wanted to talk about anger as far as from a rage perspective and the emotions within our bodies that create that rage or anger that turns into rage. Last week we had looked at Ephesians chapter 4. And I want to again look at Ephesians chapter 4 very quickly. And there are some things that the Apostle Paul tells the Christians that we need to remove from our life in order to inherit the kingdom of God. And very, very typical of the Apostle Paul, Paul does not just tell us what we need to remove, but he either tells us how to remove it or what to replace it with. And in the midst of this fourth chapter, in verse 26 and 27, Paul says, be angry and do not sin. Now, if you remember, even though last week we weren't talking about anger yet, I was still preparing this lesson, we identified this as being angry was not sin, but that we are not to sin in our anger. And Paul says one of the ways in which we do that is, he says, do not let the sun go down upon your anger. Okay, so I want to keep that in mind as we study this. And I want to look at the power of the emotions. Emotions control us unless we learn to control them. What else has the power to make a parent grab a child and throw them across the room against a wall while spewing profanity? And friends, I have witnessed this firsthand. You don't deal with people that I deal with on a regular basis and not witness some form of anger that manifests itself in rage. I've seen 2-year-olds that have been picked up and thrown. I've seen children who have been in situations they shouldn't be. I've seen children with scars, both mentally and physically. And it's the emotion and the lack of control of that emotion. What else has the power to take a young married couple who are in love, think the world of each other, and make them into a couple of miserable coexisters who only do what is barely necessary to remain under the same roof? Friends, just to be open and honest with you, I have experienced, at least in a limited form, that kind of emotion. What has the power to make family members, when they get together, yell at each other and eventually simply avoid contact with each other? sometimes not speaking for years. 2 weeks ago, we had my maternal grandmother's family reunion. And I had several relatives that were not present because of the emotions of anger and rage that exist deeply. Our emotions, the feelings deep inside of us, have power. And if we don't learn to deal with those emotions, they can ruin our lives. Now, I do want to say this. Before I go on, emotions are not bad. God created emotions. There's time and place and circumstances that bring out emotions that are capable of destroying us. But remember, God created emotions. God created love. God created passion. God created desire. And God created anger. Okay? I do want you to remember that. God created anger. I want to go to James. Before we turn to James chapter 1, I want to say that James, it is thought that the book of James is the oldest book in the New Testament, written before the Gospels. James wrote before most of the letters to the Apostle Paul. It would seem that James wrote when the Christians at Jerusalem were dispersed abroad into the world. And James is writing to Christians who have been driven out of their homes. They've been excommunicated from their Jewish roots, their faith in Judaism. They've been excommunicated from their families and their places in which they live. And so they are living scattered abroad. James says when he addresses his letter to the 12 tribes, dispersed. Or if you're reading from the King James, he might say scattered abroad. And so in James chapter 1 and verse 19, James says, "Know this, my beloved brothers, let every person be quick to hear, slow to speak, slow to anger." Notice, James does not say, again, James does not say never become angry, never get upset. James says be slow. And he says this is the reason. The anger of man, human rage, does not produce the righteousness of God. Remember who James is talking to. James has the audacity in verse 2 and the straightforward approach of saying to these people who have been beaten down, beaten up, maybe they've had loved ones who have been killed in persecution. James has the audacity and the straightforward approach, and I wish I had the guts that James has, to say, count it all joy, brothers, when you meet with trials of various kinds. Can't you imagine being a Christian in the first century and reading James' letter? And people would start to snicker and be like, wow. James says, for you know how the testing of your faith produces steadfastness. James is getting serious here. The testing of your faith produces steadfastness, and let steadfastness have its full effect, that you may be perfect and complete, wanting nothing. James says there is a purpose to the testing of our faith. And it is so that we, as we overcome one test after the next test, that we build up steadfastness. And eventually, we reach perfection. And we're no longer lacking anything. It is not our circumstances, just like the Christians that James is writing to in the first century. It is not our circumstances that cause our anger issues, although they may be what triggers it. But it's how we respond to those circumstances. Anger Anger is an emotion created by God that has a purpose. In Matthew chapter 21, Jesus became angry, and it was a righteous anger. We read this a couple of weeks ago. Matthew chapter 21, verse 12. And Jesus entered the temple and drove out. Can't you imagine this? Drove out all who sold and bought in the temple. He overturned the tables. This is a guy that's demonstrating quite a bit of anger here, if you ask most psychologists. He overturned the tables of the money changers and the seats of those who sold pigeons. He said to them, "It is written, my house shall be called a house of prayer, but you make it a den of robbers," the ESV says. Thieves, the King James says. Anger in and of itself is neither good nor bad, although I would lean more towards the good since it comes from God, and it is an emotion that we feel from God. Anger is a charged moral response, and I think we see this in Jesus. It's a charged moral natural response of protective preservation. Jesus saw something happening in the temple, and since he's God, we can understand Jesus knew exactly what the purpose of the temple was. Jesus knew what was to be conducted in the temple, and that was wrong. And Jesus demonstrates, I guess you would call it an emotion of anger. Or maybe it's simply a perspective of correction. It can be a healthy emotion that motivates us to correct attitudes, behaviors, or injustices. You think about it. Let me rephrase that. If no one ever became angry when they saw injustice, would the world ever change? Would injustice ever be corrected? David, and I'm not going to go back here for time's sake, but David in 1 Samuel chapter 17 and verse 4 became angry because Goliath is hurling insults at God's people. And he says, "I will destroy you because you don't have the respect for God's people." Moses, when he came down from Mount Sinai in Exodus, and we're going to get here in a Wednesday night Bible study, Lord willing, before long. When Moses came down from Mount Sinai carrying the tablets of stone that God had written on with his own hand, the Ten Commandments, he sees the people in idolatry. And they're worshiping a golden calf. And he throws down those stones, grinds them into powder, and makes the people of Israel who were engaged in idolatry drink the water from the powder of those stones. Moses became angry with just cause. David became angry with just cause. It motivated both of those individuals to really, I think, become better leaders and to change the injustice of the world. Let me ask you this. What do you see in the world around you that makes you angry? And when is it enough for us as Christians to get up and be the leaders in our communities that we need to be to change the world? Because if we don't change the world, no one will. Now, most of the time, anger is negative. And I think this is the direction in which Don was wanting this to go. Because most of the time, we become angry, and our anger then controls us, rather than us being in control. And I think that's what we see in Moses. His anger caused him to throw down the stones, to break the stones, And anger can be an explosion, a window of opportunity for Satan to get in. It's a period of time in which spiritual warfare takes place. Turn back with me, if you will, to the book of Proverbs. We go to Proverbs chapter 19 and verse 19, where Solomon says, "A man of great wrath will pay the penalty. For if you deliver him, you will only have to do it again." Solomon says anger is repetitive. Anger is a learned response. Anger is something, Solomon says, if you deliver someone, if you save someone from his anger, you're going to have to do it again. Because unless that person changes, it is a repetitive process. So how are we going to get over that habit? Well, over here a couple chapters, Proverbs chapter 22 and verse 24, Solomon says again to his son, and the reason Solomon is writing to his son is to help his son understand how to become a godly man. Solomon says, "Make no friendship with a man given to anger, nor go with a wrathful man, lest you learn," verse 25, "lest you learn his ways and entangle yourself in a snare." Solomon is saying, those around you influence you. All of us who have anger issues, and I throw myself into that category, all of us who have anger issues learned anger from someone. I dare say that I learned anger from my parents. And I dare say that my children are in danger, unless I learn to control that anger, are in danger of learning anger habits from me. Anger's like fire. Look at it from this perspective. Fire's necessary for life. During the wintertime, we don't even think about it. There's a fire burning in the furnace back there that heats this building. It's contained. There's a fire in the stove that cooks our food. Fire is necessary for life. The emotion of anger is necessary in a form for life. But just like fire that needs to be controlled, you never hear on the news how there's a little flame inside the furnace that heats the building. You never hear the news talking about that. What you hear the news talking about is fire that is destroying communities. Wildfires that burn, houses that are destroyed by fire. The emotion itself is not necessarily bad, but it's when it gets out of control. Over here in Proverbs chapter 29 and in verse 22, Solomon says this, "A man of wrath stirs up strife, and one given to anger causes much," notice that word, "much transgression." In other words, a transgression is a sin. A person given to much anger causes sin. Very quickly, anger manifests itself in different ways. And I think we all understand the explosive kind of anger. I want to go to Jeremiah. Jeremiah chapter 17. And in Jeremiah chapter 17, I want us to look very quickly at verse 9. Jeremiah 17, verse 9. "The heart is deceitful above all things and desperately sick. Who can understand it? I, the Lord, search the heart and test the mind, to give every man according to his ways, according to the fruit of his deeds." You see, guys, unless our heart is fully given to God, there's not really much hope for us. Because God's not interested in the person who can control the outward appearance. So that's the problem with the scribes and the Pharisees. In Matthew 23, in today's Bible reading, Matthew chapter 23, one of the things Jesus chastises them about is they're capable of controlling the outward appearances. He says they're like whitewashed tombs. Outwardly, they're beautiful. Okay, maybe I'm slightly retarded. Kate will tell you I am. I love to walk through old cemeteries. It's one of my favorite places to go, to look at the stones. Mound Cemetery, when Kate and I first met, one of the places I took her was Mound Cemetery in Marietta. We walked up the mound. And I just enjoy cemeteries. But then when you think about what's under the surface, what those stones represent, it's kind of gross. The Christian who is capable of putting on a front, but not having a change of heart, is no better than the scribes and the Pharisees. So we need to change our heart. The only way that we're going to get control of the emotion of anger is from deep inside of our hearts. But before we get into that, I want to identify a couple of things, because there are people who have anger issues, and I'm one of them who has anger issues. I don't fall, at one time I did, but I no longer fall into the exploding category. We all see it. Okay? I'm gonna pick on Vernon for a little bit, because Vernon already talked to me about this, and so I think it's okay. Vernon's one of those guys that someone will come in wailing. One of his brothers or sisters, they'll just come in, oh, tears are streaming down their face, and what happened? Vernon hit me. Like, Vernon, why did you hit him? Why did you hit your sister? He's like, I don't know. I just got so angry. I'm like, okay, that's exploding anger. I experienced that. I know what exploding anger is. I know what it looks like to lose control of that emotion. Exploding anger is simply lashing out. It's expressed, it's anger, frustration that is expressed by lashing out and exploding violently. Sometimes physically, sometimes verbally. And a person experiences, to one extent or another, a loss of control. You're no longer, and when I asked Vernon, I don't know, that's what he's talking about. He has lost physical ability to control his own actions. And Vernon's as sweet a guy as you'd ever want to meet. He's got a good heart. But it's the emotion that has to be learned, he has to learn how to control. After an explosion, psychologists will tell you that there is usually a feeling of guilt, sorrow, remorse. I've experienced all of those things, and I think Vernon has probably experienced all of those things. So if you're an exploder, you will probably experience that after the explosion. Okay, we've identified that one. That one's easy. Psychologists tell us, and I think the Bible would back this up, that there's also a silent anger. The Bible refers to this as brooding anger. Sometimes we refer to it as denial. See, I call it denial because silent anger, people who become silently angry, oftentimes deny that they are angry. They deny the emotion the right to explode, but it still stays inside of them. Okay? Their expression of anger is not exploding, but rather it's a shutting down. And I learned this kind of anger to a point. This is probably not where I am yet, but I experienced this kind of anger because I felt the guilt of the exploding anger. And I didn't want to feel that guilt anymore. And so I felt that if I could keep it inside of me, I didn't have anger issues, which is not true. We express anger by shrinking into ourselves in these cases. And we bottle it up and hold it inside of our heart. We're mad, we're upset, but we don't demonstrate it where others can see it. Most people who have this have trained themselves to be this way. It's a knee-jerk reaction, like I said. It's a knee-jerk reaction because we don't want to experience the explosion and then feel the remorse and the guilt associated with the explosion. And so this response eases our conscience. Dr. Paul Meyer found from the foundation of the Meyer Meredith Clinic, and I think I've got that reference right, but Dr. Paul Meyer wrote that 95% of depression in the United States is caused by anger that is turned inwardly. Sometimes we become angry with ourselves. I didn't realize this. But apparently in the psychologist world, it's very prevalent. And so when instead of becoming angry and lashing out, we turn that inwardly and we keep it bottled up. And over time, usually long periods of time of responding to frustration and anger this way, we destroy ourselves from the inside out through what is described as clinical depression. Passive-aggressive anger. Now, to be honest, disclaimer, this is where I am. This is me right here. You know, the passive-aggressive, I heard one guy describe it this way, and I'll describe this before we go through. One guy described it this way. It's like going up the interstate at 67 miles an hour. In his state, the interstate speed limit was 65. And you're passing a semi-truck that's doing 60 miles an hour, and there's this car, and they come up behind you, and they're riding your bumper as you're passing the semi-truck. And you're like, man, that's just not right. And you ease off the gas. That's who I am. Go up the interstate, I'm doing 67 miles an hour. I'm past somebody, someone comes up behind me. I did it in Akron, Ohio. Speed limit's 55 in Akron. I'm doing 65, okay? I'm breaking the law. I'm getting in the fast lane. Suddenly there's nowhere in the slow lane to pull over. I'm sitting here, 2 lanes of traffic, 65 miles an hour, I'm going up the road. There's this line of traffic behind me, and I can tell they're just like, this one guy behind me, he keeps going over across the white line like he's wanting to pass me, and there's no passing room, so he pulls back over again. He keeps doing that. Mile after mile, he does that. There's nowhere for me to go either, but I'm enjoying life. My passive-aggressive nature's coming out. I'm like, oh yeah. He just passed. Poor guy's bald. I said, look at that guy. He done lost all his hair back there. I made him pull it out. Okay, passive-aggressive anger. I fit this category perfectly. So I've got to learn. I've got to work on this. This is expressed by complaining quietly to others about your problems. That's me. Agreeing to do something that you really don't want to do to begin with, and then backing out. Sometimes I do that. Criticizing others. We criticize others to make ourselves feel better about who we are. So, what's the fix to all of this? I think the fix really comes from God's Word. The fix really comes from God's Word. But anger, according to psychologists, is a secondary emotion. And I think that's why That's why when we read in the Bible about negative things about anger, even though it's an emotion from God, it is a secondary emotion to a deeper problem. So in order to fix it, we've got to find and identify the deeper problem. It's easier to become angry than to face that deeper problem. Because a lot of times, and sometimes, my wife said, I've got to do a disclaimer here. Sometimes we can't fix someone else. Sometimes the deeper problem has to do with someone else and we can't fix it. And so we become angry. Or as my wife says, I can't fix you. Okay, she didn't say that. I did. Kate would never say that. 3 things that cause anger, the emotion of anger. First is hurt, second is frustration, and third is insecurity. So if we work on our inner being with the hurt or the frustration, which is where my wife deals with all the time, one of those two, I don't think she's insecure. But I tend to do things that hurt my wife unintentionally. Sometimes it's frustration. I want to go through these very quickly and we'll look at some ways in which we can help that. Anger is like a light. If you've got a newer vehicle, sometimes there's a little light that pops up on the dash and it says something's wrong. The check engine light pops on. Anger's like that. When you feel yourself becoming angry, look for something deeper. My dad has a solution to this. He has the perfect solution. My dad, being the mechanic that he is, fixes the check engine light on his truck by putting a piece of duct tape over the light. You're never going to fix it, Dad. You don't fix the problem. The check engine light is not going to go away. Yes, you've covered it up. That's what anger does. Anger, the check engine light comes on. If we don't look at the bottom problem, maybe the anger, when it's turned inwardly, we think we've got rid of it, but all we're doing is putting a piece of duct tape over top of the light bulb. It's still there. Anger artificially helps us feel in control when we're out of control. And so sometimes we lash out and the explosive anger appears. Hurt. Hurt usually comes in the form of unmet needs. Whether those unmet needs are real or we perceive them as real. The children and I have been through several things, they'll come up, not so much anymore. I think they've learned this, but I remember Ruth and Vernon particularly coming up and saying, Papa, I need, and they'll point to something. I say, wait a minute, we need to talk about what a need is. A need is something that your life is going to end if you don't have. Obviously, the bubble gum in the candy store is not a need. Your life is not going to end if you don't have it. So sometimes we perceive something as a need, and when we don't have that need met or perceived need met, we become angry. Oh yes, it happens. I'm the parent of 9 children. I can tell you that happens. In Proverbs chapter 19 and in verse 3, Solomon says, when a man's folly brings his way to ruin, his heart rages against the Lord. How many times do we have an unmet need or a unmet perceived need in life and we blame God for it? The loss of a loved one. How easy it is, speaking from experience, how easy it would have been when my brother died in a tractor accident 3 years ago to blame God for my little brother's death. After all, God's in control, right? But really, wasn't it a decision of my brother's to brush hog a field where he knew there was problems, where danger existed? decision he met. Proverbs chapter 27, in verse 4, says, "Wrath is cruel, anger is overwhelming, but who can stand before jealousy?" See, jealousy is rooted in hurt, and anger is often the result of hurt or jealousy. I'm not going to go back to Genesis chapter 37 for time's sake, but we can notice Psalm chapter 10. I do want to go to Psalm chapter 10 because a lot of the Psalms, you will see David expresses anger because he's been hurt. Psalm chapter 10 is a prime example of this. And I wished I could have gone through all of these, but time would not permit it. But Psalm chapter 10 goes like this. In the first part of the Psalm, we see the hurt in verses 1 through 12. "Why, O Lord, do you stand far away? Feel the hurt? See, David's hurting. Why do you hide yourself in time of trouble? In arrogance, the wicked hotly pursue the poor." The injustice that he's feeling here. "Let them be caught in the schemes that they have devised. For the wicked boast of the desires of his soul, and the greedy for gain curses, and renounces the Lord. In the pride of his face, the wicked does not seek him. All his thoughts are, there goes God. There is no God. His ways prosper at all times. Your judgments are on high, out of his sight. For all his foes, he puffs at them. He says in his heart, I shall not be moved. Throughout all generations, I shall not meet adversity. His mouth is filled with cursing, and deceit and oppression. Under his tongue are mischief and iniquity. He sits in ambush in the village. In hiding places, he murders the innocent. His eyes stealthily watch for the helpless. He lurks in ambush like a lion in his thicket. He lurks that he may seize the poor. He seizes the poor when he draws him into his net. The helpless are crushed, sink down, and fall by his might. See the psalmist here. And in verse 11 he says in his heart, God has forgotten. He has hidden his face. He will never see it. See, the psalmist is feeling all of this hurt and injustice. And you can almost feel the emotion of anger playing through this psalm. But then there's the second part. And I think this is where we have to rely on God. You see, the psalmist doesn't end with verse 11. The psalmist said, God is the fix. God is the solution. And he calls on God to fix the problem. He says, arise, O God, lift up your hand. Forget not the afflicted. Why does the wicked renounce God and say in his heart, you will not call to account? But you do see, for you note mischief and vexation, that you may take into your hand to the people, or into the hands to you, the helpless, commit himself. You have been the helper of the fatherless. Break the arm of the wicked and evildoer. Call his wickedness to account till you find none. See, the psalmist is saying God is the answer. I'm turning to God. Whatever our emotion, the answer is God. And calling God into help with whatever situation we're dealing with. There's a song we sing, take it to the Lord in prayer. That's what the psalmist is doing here. And in the bottom part of this, the psalmist is then transferring his emotion of anger at the injustice, at the hurt. He is then mentally transferring his emotion to God's shoulders. After calling on God, he transfers the emotion to God, that God can bear it. And he says this, the Lord is king forever. The nations perish from his land. The Lord, O Lord, you hear the desire of the afflicted. You will strengthen their heart. You will incline your ear to justice, to the fatherless, the oppressed, so that man who is of the earth may strike terror no more. The psalmist has taken his anger. He's gone to God. He's asked for justice, and then he transfers. It's a mental process that the psalmist has gone through. And Psalms throughout the book of Psalms have this pattern to them. Hurt unresolved over time builds thin layers of resentment. If we're hurt and we don't transfer that hurt to God, over time it builds resentment, bitterness, and that surrounds and poisons our heart. Frustration. Frustration is oftentimes manifested in unmet expectations. I want to turn back to 2 Kings. I want you to see a wife whom David loved, who was precious to him, who had certain expectations of what her husband would be like as king. And when David fails to meet these expectations, anger is the result. 2 Kings chapter 5, and in verse, I think I've got the right passage, verse 11, let me make sure. No, I don't. I apologize. I believe it must be 1 Kings chapter 5. Let me try that. Anyway, I can tell you what's going on, what I want to go with. And this is not right either. Anyway, I'll find the right passage. Never mind. 1 Chronicles. Before we go there, let's go to 2 Kings chapter 5, though. I got one step ahead of myself. 2 Kings chapter 5, and in verse 11, we have Naaman. Naaman is a man who came with expectations. He heard there's a prophet in Israel who can cure his leprosy. He comes with certain expectations to Israel. And look at what he says in 2 Kings 5, verse 11. But Naaman was angry and went away, saying, Behold, I thought he would surely come out to me and stand and call upon the name of the Lord his God and wave his hand over the place and cure the leper. What was Naaman told to do? You see, the thing is, the prophet never even came out. He sent his servant out. Man, Naaman's disappointed. There's a lack of what he expected here. He says, aren't there rivers in my own country? Paraphrasing. Aren't there rivers in my own country just as good as the Jordan River? Can I wash in them and be clean? He says, are not Abana and Pharpar, the rivers of Damascus, better than all the waters of Israel? Could I not wash in them and be clean? So he turned and went away in a rage. See, Naaman had unfulfilled expectations. Thankfully, if you read the rest of the account, he has a servant that manages to convince him of common sense, and he's cured of his leprosy. Unfulfilled expectations or frustration sometimes is rooted in embarrassment. And this is where I want to introduce to you David and a wife that he loved, but also a wife that had certain expectations about what she wanted her husband to be as king. In 1 Chronicles chapter 15 and in verse 29, 1 Chronicles 15 verse 29, and the ark of the covenant of the Lord came to the city of David, and Michal, the daughter of Saul, looked out the window and saw King David. Notice what she saw. Dancing in celebration. And she despised him in her heart. Why was he celebrating? I think of Danny. You know, Danny's always happy. He's always celebrating. He's always, woo! You need to pick her up or have Danny Allen around. Okay? I see David as that kind of a person. David is celebrating. The ark of God is coming home. He's excited. He doesn't keep his emotions bottled up. David's the kind of guy, it's all out there open to see. And his wife is embarrassed that he is out here in front of the ark of God singing and dancing, celebrating. Her expectations are not met. And the Bible says she despised her husband. And you can see a ruined marriage. A desire or a wish is a request. And when we don't get what we hope for, we are disappointed. And anger can sometimes be the result. When you have a demand, think of this. Your expectations are almost a demand. When you expect something, whether it's from someone else or whether it's from God, when you expect something, it's almost a demand. So maybe we need to turn that over to God. Our expectations should be what God expects of us. Sometimes we have expectations of what life is going to bring. Friends, life has a way of changing things. When I was young, I had expectations of what life would be like and what having a family would be like. And I'm not saying that it's all bad and disappointment. It's just simply not what I expected. In Psalm 37, I want us to look here at verse 4. The psalmist says, "Delight yourself in the Lord, and he will give you the desires of your heart." That doesn't say when we delight in God, our desire is to delight in God's ways and God's paths. It is not to desire for ourselves. Back up a chapter in Psalm 36, verse 5, the psalmist says, "Your steadfast love, O Lord, extends to the heavens. Your faithfulness to the clouds. Your righteousness is like a mountain of God. Your judgments are like the great deep. Man and beast you save, O Lord. How precious is your steadfast love, O God. The children of mankind take refuge in the shadow of your wings. They feast on the abundance of your house, and you give them to drink from the river of your delights. For with you is the fountain of life. In your light we see light. Oh, continue your steadfast love to those who know you, and to your righteousness to the upright of heart. Let not the foot of arrogance come upon me, nor the hand of the wicked drive me away. There are evildoers lie the evildoers lie fallen. They are thrust down, unable to rise. See, when our expectations are God's expectations, we need not fear disappointment. And the third is insecurity. It's an attack on our self-worth or who we are. Insecurity, sometimes we may not view ourselves as insecure until someone makes a personal attack on who we are. Proverbs 18 verse 19 says, Proverbs 18:19, "A brother offended is more unyielding than a strong city. and quarreling is like the boars of a castle. Well, I don't know if you've ever seen pigs quarrel, fight. Well, that's a loud, obnoxious scene. But yet, Solomon says, that could happen to brothers when we are attacked in our self-worth. We'll go very quickly here because time is way overpassed. I've way overshot my normal time, and I was afraid I would. But let's look at 1 Samuel chapter 18. And I do apologize for the time. 1 Samuel chapter 18, and I don't have the particular verse here. I want to give you an overview of what's going on. 1 Samuel chapter 18, we see again David and Saul. And in this chapter, David is very popular. David, as Saul comes up to the city, it says in verse 6, as they were coming home, when David returned from striking down the Philistine, the women came out of all the cities of Israel, singing and dancing to meet King Saul, with tambourines, with songs of joy, with musical instruments. And the women sang to one another as they celebrated. Saul has struck down his thousands, and David his 10,000s. Oh dear. Here Saul has a problem. His self-value is under attack. And Saul was very angry at this saying. Displeased him. He said, they have ascribed to David 10,000, and to me they have ascribed thousands. And what more can he have but the kingdom? And Saul eyed David from that day on. What a horrible thing. And yet, Saul feels insecure. And it manifests itself in anger. In Acts chapter 5, and I'm not going to go back there, but the Jewish leaders of Acts chapter 5 and verse 12 feel threatened because Christianity is becoming popular. The disciples are making converts. They're spreading the gospel, and they become angry and they lash out. Why do you think we have persecution in the church throughout the New Testament? Because the Jewish leaders were insecure and they felt threatened. Whose approval are we seeking to begin with? God's approval is the only approval that we need. We don't need to prove our self-worth to the world. We don't even need to prove our self-worth to ourselves. Saying that is easier than applying it. But Solomon says in Ecclesiastes chapter 7, and in verse 21, do not take to heart all the things that people say, lest you hear your servant cursing you. Your heart knows that many times you yourself have cursed others. Solomon says, don't take it to heart when he criticizes you, because you know deep down in, from time to time, you criticize others. In closing, if we can find the underlying emotion, whether it's hurt or one of the other emotions, unmet expectations, attack on our self-worth, if we can identify the underlying emotion that is triggering anger, then we can work on those areas and avoid placing ourselves in positions where we lose control. But also understand, as Kate said, sometimes the root of our anger might be out of our control, so that we have to deal with the root cause, in a different way. Through one form of anger or another. Yet when we become angry, remember what Paul says, be angry and do not sin. I want to close today by reminding you that Jesus is the answer. Jesus has a way of changing the heart. Taking what we have and working with it, turn it over to God. Bottom line, turn it over to God. If there's anyone here who's subject to the invitation, I want you to make your wants and wishes known. As together we stand and as we sing 609.